I was dressed for a meeting that didn't exist. I stood in the bedroom, fully dressed, blazer on, for about 10 minutes. Then I sat down on the bed. Then I laughed a little. Then I didn't. That was the day I understood what transition actually means. Not the date you mark in the calendar, a Tuesday when you're overdressed for nothing. My name is Diane Kaufman. I'm 66 years old. I planned my retirement better than I've planned most things, and I've planned a lot of things. I had the financial structure in place 2 years before I stopped working. I had a date. I had a version of what the days would look like. I had a list, because I always have a list, of things I would finally have time for. Travel, reading, being more present, saying yes to the things I'd been saying not right now to for 3 decades. I did not plan for the strange, and the strange came anyway. Here's what I actually think happens when a certain kind of person retires. Someone who has been building things since their 30s. Someone for whom work was not just what they did, but the primary way they understood themselves in the world. The financial planning, the logistics, the calendar, those are solvable problems. I solved them. I was thorough about it, possibly more thorough than necessary, which is something people who've run businesses tend to do when faced with uncertainty they can't fully control. What you cannot plan for, not fully, is who you are when the work stops. I'm not going to pretend I saw that coming. I didn't. And I'm someone who is professionally good at anticipating problems, which made it particularly inconvenient. I want to tell you what the strange actually was. Not the version I might offer at dinner, where it becomes a manageable anecdote with a tidy observation at the end. The real version, which is less flattering and considerably more useful. I had been very good at my work. I say that plainly, not as a boast, as context. When you build something over 3 decades, when you are the kind of person who knows how to make things work and is more often right than wrong, you develop a particular relationship with your own competence. You trust it. You reach for it without thinking. It becomes, and I didn't fully see this until I no longer had it in its original form, something you use to locate yourself. Where am I? What do I think? What needs to happen? The competence answers. And you feel, in answering, like a person who exists with purpose, who matters to something, and then you retire. And none of that has anywhere to go. It's not that retirement made me incompetent. I want to be precise about this because I think people misread it. My abilities didn't change. My experience didn't disappear. What changed was that competence without a context that requires it is invisible, to you and to everyone else. There's no problem to solve, no decision that needs me, no room where my read on the situation is the one they're waiting for. That is a very specific kind of quiet, and I had not been quiet in that way for a very long time. Richard noticed before I did. He noticed and he waited, which is what Richard does. He has enormous patience for things that aren't yet ready to be said. He waited about 3 weeks. We were at dinner, just the 2 of us, which still feels slightly new after so many years of schedules that kept us from it. And he said very quietly, "You're not bored, you're lost. Those aren't the same thing." I didn't respond for about 2 hours, not because I was angry, because I was thinking. Then I came back and said, "You're right." He nodded, poured the rest of the wine, didn't make anything of it. That's Richard. So I want to go through what I've learned since that dinner, what the strangeness actually was, where it came from, and what, slowly, not all at once, not in any order I would have preferred, I've started to do with it. Because I think there are people watching this who planned well, who did everything they were supposed to do, who are now standing in some version of that bedroom, fully prepared for a life that still feels like it hasn't quite started. This one's for them. The first thing I had to face was the identity question, and I want to be careful here because it's easy to turn this into a cliché. I lost myself in my work, and that's not quite what happened. What happened is more specific. I didn't lose myself in the work. I always had a life outside of it. A marriage, children, real friendships, not just professional relationships. Interests I pursued when I had time. I was not one-dimensional. I want to be clear about that. What I discovered was that a significant portion of my foundational sense of self was structurally connected to what I was producing. Not everything, but more than I thought. And when the producing stopped, I had to find out what was left standing on its own, independent of the work, independent of what I was building or solving or being responsible for. That is an uncomfortable thing to discover at 65. It's more uncomfortable when you're the kind of person who considers herself quite self-aware. I had thought I was self-aware. I had written recommendations for other women on the importance of knowing who you are outside of what you do. I had said all the right things about it, and then I stood in a bedroom for 10 minutes in a blazer with nowhere to go, and I had to be honest about how much of me was still in those things I'd said, and how much of me was in what I actually did every day. I talked to Sophie about this. My daughter is building her own thing now, at 37, and she is at the stage where the work and the self feel completely fused, where what she's creating and who she is are nearly indistinguishable, and that fusion is part of what makes her effective. I didn't tell her to be careful about it. You can't say that at 37 and have it land usefully. I just listened, and I recognized something I hadn't expected to recognize. I recognized myself a quarter of a century ago. The fusing is necessary at that stage. It's what gets things built. What nobody tells you, what I would have said without believing it before, is that you have to unfuse at some point. And the unfusing is its own project, longer in some ways than the original building, and considerably less legible from the outside. The planning fallacy is the thing I find most worth examining, because I'm someone who is good at planning. That's not a small claim. I spent 30 years being paid, in part, for my ability to plan things that other people hadn't thought to plan yet. I've helped other women think through transitions. I know the vocabulary of it, and I still made this particular mistake. The mistake was assumption. I assumed that the self I had built through the work would remain fully intact when the work was removed. The way you might assume a structure will hold after you've removed the scaffolding. It's not an unreasonable assumption, and sometimes it's right. What I discovered is that the scaffolding had been doing more than scaffolding. Not everything. The foundation was solid. My marriage, my values, the things I care about, my sense of what matters. Those didn't require the work to support them, but there were layers I hadn't examined, layers of identity, daily structure, the particular kind of purpose that comes from being responsible for something ongoing, that the work had been quietly providing for 30 years. When the work went, those layers needed something else to rest on. I had not arranged for that something else. I had planned the exit with great care. I had not planned for the self who would be standing on the other side of it. My mother would have identified this immediately. She had a way of seeing exactly what I'd missed and conveying it without saying it directly. A very precise kind of silence, or a look that lasted just a moment too long. I still hear that silence sometimes. I try to be useful about it rather than annoyed. The marriage piece surprised me. Richard retired 3 years before I did. He was fine immediately, not performing fine, actually fine. Found his rhythm within a few weeks. became genuinely content in a way that was, I'll say plainly, slightly maddening to observe from across the house while I was still working. I watched him for 3 years. He never mentioned that he was watching me watch him. That's his particular form of tact. When I finally stopped working, I understood his adjustment even less than before, because now I was the one who was not fine, and the contrast was not comfortable. What we found gradually, without turning it into a project, which would have been my instinct and was not what was needed, is that we had built a marriage around 2 occupied people. 2 people who came home to each other from full days pointing in different directions, who had a great deal to say because they'd each been somewhere different. The tension of 2 busy people sustains a certain kind of marriage, in ways you don't notice until the tension is gone. Now we were both just here, available, present, all the time. That's not a problem. I want to be clear about that. I chose to marry Richard. Given the opportunity to choose again, I would choose him without hesitation, possibly faster. But it's a different version of marriage than the one we'd been doing, and neither of us had practiced this version before. We had to learn to inhabit the same space as 2 people who weren't on their way somewhere, 2 people who were simply here, with full days that didn't have external structure telling them where to be. I said at some point, this is genuinely new for both of us. We don't know how to do it yet. We're going to have to figure it out the way we've figured out everything, which is imperfectly and eventually, and probably with a few conversations that are harder than they need to be. Richard said, "We've done harder." He was right. What helped, and I mean this practically, was deciding not to perform being fine, not to organize my way into comfort before I'd actually found it. I have a tendency toward that, toward making things look right before they feel right. It's efficient in business, in a marriage, in a life. It's a way of postponing the actual problem without noticing that's what you're doing. I had to let myself be in the unfamiliar for a while, without fixing it. That required more tolerance for uncertainty than I'm naturally inclined to, which meant it required practice. What work was actually doing, this is the part that took me longest to see clearly. The work was solving several problems simultaneously, every single day, without my having to ask it to. The obvious ones, purpose, income, structure, the sense of being needed, but also the less obvious ones. It was answering the question of how to use a day. Every day, the work answered that question for me. It told me where to be, what to think about, what to produce. I never had to ask, what is this day for? Retirement requires you to answer that question yourself, freshly, every morning. And that question, answered from scratch without the context of work to frame it, is more demanding than I expected. Not in a painful way exactly, but it requires a different kind of effort than I'd been making for 30 years. Not the effort of solving or building or producing, the effort of choosing, small, daily, without the structure that used to make the choice obvious, what the day is for. I was not good at this at first. I filled the early months with things that looked like the right things and weren't quite. Useful seeming activities that were actually placeholders. I attended things I wasn't genuinely interested in because being somewhere felt better than being nowhere. I read with intention and absorbed less than I expected because my mind kept reaching for a problem that wasn't there. I had lunch with people I realized I liked less than I thought, which is a discovery retirement will make you confront, because the shared context that made those relationships feel close turns out to have been the work rather than the actual person. That's an uncomfortable thing to find out and unavoidable. I reorganized parts of the house that didn't need reorganizing. I started things I didn't finish. I was, essentially, waiting, without fully knowing that's what I was doing, waiting for something to feel like mine. Here's what I've come to think about the strangeness. It's not a malfunction. It's not a sign that you did something wrong or failed to prepare correctly. The strangeness is what it feels like to be somewhere genuinely new. When you're in unfamiliar territory, real unfamiliar territory, not the kind you can navigate by competence and experience, it feels strange. That's what strange is. The sensation of not knowing where you are well enough to know what to reach for. I had known very well where I was for 30 years. I'd built a detailed map of that terrain and navigated it in all conditions. The map was accurate. The navigation was reliable. What I'm doing now is making a new map, in less familiar territory, with less certainty about what's around the corner. And I'm learning, slowly, with Richard's patient observation and with more tolerance for the process than I would have had 10 years ago, to find that more interesting than alarming. That learning is still in progress, but it is actually in progress, which is different from where I was 18 months ago. I don't have a tidy conclusion for this one. I had a version of one. I tried to write it several times. Each time it felt too resolved, too clean for something that isn't clean yet. And the experience I'm describing is not yet resolved, which means a resolved ending would be a small dishonesty. I'm not interested in those. What I can say is this: planning well is not the same as being prepared. Those are different things, and retirement makes the difference visible in ways you don't expect. The plans hold. The structure holds. What you have to build, after all of that holds, is the version of yourself who knows how to live inside it, who knows what to do with open days, who knows when the competence has nowhere obvious to go, what she actually wants to do with the rest of it. That is the project nobody mentions during the planning phase, and it's the most significant one I've taken on in years. I'm not done with it. I'm not sure it ends. My grandmother said once, just once, because she was not a woman who repeated herself, that a woman who knows who she is has everything she needs. I spent most of my working life assuming I was that woman. I'm learning now what she actually meant. That's the closest I'll get to an ending today. Tell me, what surprised you most about retirement? Not the practical thing, the internal thing, the thing you didn't plan for, even after all your careful planning. Leave it in the comments. I read all of them. I find them considerably more useful than I expected to. If this landed somewhere for you, the like button is there. And if someone you know is standing in their version of that bedroom right now, overdressed for nothing, wondering why everything they planned isn't quite doing what they expected, send this their way. They'll recognize it, and it might help to know they're not alone in it. I'll be back next week. Subscribe if you want to be here for it. Take care of yourselves.